Alrighty. Welcome to tonight's stream. Tonight I got Nate here with me, and he's interested in listening to this book that I've been reading for a while. It's called Resident Evil: The Umbrella Conspiracy by S.D. Perry. It's one of 7 books. It's a little series. I like it a lot. And since it's October, I figured why not just do a little mini series through this book throughout the month.
Yeah, is it a kind of Halloween themed book or
Yeah, it's got zombies in it.
perfect?
Yeah, it's got like zombies and the special tactics and rescue squad characters are featured in this, of course. And what's been going on is basically there's been some attacks, like cannibalistic attacks, some by human, and there were some uh, reports of been attacked by these vicious dogs.
Hmm.
And there's like the numbers of the grisly murders start increasing in with in the mid, what was it, year 1998. Yeah, and so the Star Special and Tactics Rescue Squad were sent to save the Raccoon City, which is like a remote city in what was it? Um, Somewhere in the U.S. I forget where. I thought it was Ohio, but I'm not sure. But in this story, but so this team are set up, were sent to investigate. Well, actually, 2 teams, but there was the Alpha team and the Bravo team. The Bravos, their helicopter mysteriously malfunctioned, and they had to set it down. And one of the dogs killed the Bravos, and they had to flee to the Spencer Mansion estate, which is in the middle of a forest among the outskirts of the city, Raccoon City.
Hmm.
And the alphas had to go and find out what's going on with the Bravos, and pretty much the Bravos aren't to be found. And one of the alphas, who gets killed by the mutant dogs early on in the novel, he finds a dismembered hand holding a gun, and the vicious mutant dogs come out. They look like these abominations, like I guess they've sort of been described like hellhounds, mutant hellhounds from hell, and there's like no skin on them. It's just muscle and sinew and red eyes, and
Hmm.
the dogs get one of the alphas, and everyone else, they have to run for their lives to the Spencer Mansion, which is really fancy, and it's full of these secret passageways and traps. And um, yeah, so they flee to that, and everyone is split up because uh, Wesker sent Chris to check out. Well, one of the captain of the Alphas, Albert Wesker, sent marksman and decent pilot who was former Air Force, Chris Redfield, to investigate. And then they hear gunshots, and then Wesker sends off the other 2, Jill and Barry, uh, to go see what's up. Oh, and I almost forgot. Another the alphas. He's not so brave when it comes to life and death situations. So the current assigned pilot, he escaped with the helicopter. So that's why they had to
Hmm.
run to the mansion. Yeah, and as the book goes further on, Wesker is revealed to be a traitor to the Special Tactics and Rescue Squad. He's a very bad guy working for the really shady pharmaceutical corporation Umbrella Incorporated. And in the, I think we're in the middle of the book, and before I ended it on part 2, Wesker is blackmailing Barry Burton, saying that, threatening to go after her, Barry's family, and of course Barry's family means everything to him. And also in part 2, Chris Redfield, he finds one of the Bravos who has survived, but she dropped her gun. So, and she thought that Chris was one of the zombie creatures, the human zombie creatures. And when Chris walked in the room opening the door, Rebecca sprayed him with bug spray.
Oh
Yeah.
my.
Yeah. So, and Rebecca's the youngest of the Bravos, but she's a prodigy in chemistry, so she's also a medic. So it's been Chris and Rebecca together. Jill's been pretty much on her own. Barry, I think, ran into her once, but yeah. So part 3 ended was Chris left Rebecca in a piano room, and she was playing. She had like experience playing the piano when she was younger, and she played the music that was on, and hold on, yeah, she played the music, and there's like a secret door, so she found a little secret door after playing the piano, and she wants to go find this emblem to switch with the other one, and she heads back into the secret room, smiling. Chris told her to stay put, but she wouldn't be gone more than a minute or two, and perhaps when he got back, she'd have something to show him, a real contribution towards solving the secrets of the mansion, and proof that she wasn't so useless after all. That's how chapter 10 ends. So we'll go ahead right into chapter 11.
All right.
All right. Barry and Jill stood in the covered walkway by the puzzle lock, breathing the clean night air. Beyond the high walls, the crickets and cicadas hummed their ceaseless song, a soothing reminder that there was still a sane world outside. Jill's brush with disaster had left her lightheaded and somewhat nauseous, and Barry had gently led her to the back door, suggesting that the fresh air would do her good. He hadn't found Chris or Wesker, though he seemed certain that they were still alive. He brought her up to speed quickly, retracing his meandering path through the house as Jill leaned against the wall, still taking deep breaths of warm air. And when I heard the shots, I came running. Barry rubbed absently at his short beard. He smiled at her, a somewhat hesitant grin. Lucky for you, another couple of seconds, you would have been a Jill sandwich. Yes, I knew that reference from the first game was in it, the Jill sandwich reference. Yeah, this novel, by the way, is based on the first game, pretty much. So, Jill smiled back gratefully, nodding, but noticed that he seemed a little strained, the humor forced, odd. She wouldn't have figured Barry as the type to tense up in the face of danger. Is it any wonder? We're trapped here. We can't find the team, and this entire mansion is out to get us. Not exactly a laugh riot. I hope I can return the favor if you ever get in a tight spot, she said softly. Really, you saved my life. Barry looked away, flushing slightly. Glad I could help, he said gruffly. Just be careful. This place is dangerous. She nodded again, thinking of how close she'd come to dying. She shivered slightly, then forced the thoughts away. They needed to be concentrating on Chris and Wesker. So you do think they're still alive? Yeah, besides the shell casings, there was a whole trail of those ghouls in the other wing, all with clean headshots. Gotta be Chris. Though I had to splatter a couple more of them upstairs, so I figure he holed up somewhere along the way. Barry nodded toward the copper diagram set into the wall. So was this star crest here already? Jill frowned, a little surprised at the abrupt change of topic. Chris was one of Barry's closest friends. No, I found it in another room with a trap. This place seems to be full of them. In fact, maybe we should look for Wesker and Chris together. No telling what they might have stumbled into, or what else could happen to either of us. Barry shook his head. I don't know. I mean, you're right, we should watch our step, but there are a lot of rooms, and our first priority ought to be securing an escape. If we split up, we can try to find the rest of these crests, and look for Chris at the same time, and Wesker, though his demeanor didn't change. Jill had the sudden distinct impression that Barry was uncomfortable. He had turned away to study the copper diagram, but it almost seemed as if he was trying to avoid eye contact. Besides, he said, we know what we're up against now. As long as we use a little common sense, we'll be fine. Barry, are you okay? You seem tired. It wasn't the right word, but it was the only one that came to mind. He sighed, finally looking at her. He did seem tired, though there were dark circles under his eyes, and his wide shoulders were slumped. No, I'm all right. Just worried about Chris, you know? Jill nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Since he'd pulled her out of the trap, he'd been acting unusually subdued, even nervous. Paranoid much? This is Barry Burton you're talking about, the backbone of the Raccoon Stars. Not to mention the man who just saved your life. What could he possibly be hiding? Jill knew she was probably being overly suspicious, but all the same, she decided to keep her mouth shut about Trent's computer. Trent is a secret ally to the stars, or so he says. He gave Jill a little mini computer device full of data and different files and names and clues on how to navigate around the mansion. So yeah, forgot to mention that earlier, but now you know. Um, Back to where I left off. After all Jill had been through, she wasn't feeling particularly trusting, and it sounded like he already had a pretty good idea of the mansion's layout, so it wasn't like he needed the information. That's it. Keep rationalizing. Next thing, you'll be suspecting Captain Wesker of planning this whole thing. Black meets kettle. Jill scoffed inwardly as she pushed herself away from the wall, and she and Barry walked slowly back toward the house. Now that was paranoid. They stopped as they reached the door, Jill taking a few final lungfuls of sweet air, letting it settle her nerves. Barry had taken out his Colt Python and was reloading the empty chambers, his expression grim. I thought I'd go back over to the East Wing, see if I could pick up Chris's trail, he said. Why don't you head upstairs and start looking for the other crests? That way we can cover all of the rooms, work our way back to the main hall. Jill nodded, and Barry opened the door, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. A wave of cold swept past them, and Jill sighed, trying to prepare herself to face another maze of frigid, shadowy halls, another series of unopened doors, and the secrets that lay behind them. You're gonna do fine, Barry said smoothly, placing a warm hand on her shoulder and gently ushering her back inside. As soon as the door closed behind them, he lifted his hand in a casual salute, smiling. Good luck, he said, and before she could respond, he turned and hurried away, weapon in hand. With another creak of ancient metal, he slipped through the double doors at the end of the hall and was gone. Jill stared after him, alone once again in the chilled, stinking silence of the dim corridor. It wasn't her imagination. Barry was keeping something from her. But was it something she needed to worry about, or was he just trying to protect her? Maybe he found Chris or Wesker dead and didn't want to tell me. It wasn't a pleasant thought, but it would explain his strange, hurried behavior. He obviously wanted them to get out of the house as soon as possible and wanted her to stay on the west side. And the way he'd fixated on the puzzle mechanism, seeming more concerned with their exit than with Chris's or Wesker's whereabouts. She looked down at the two crumpled figures in the hall, at the tacky, drying pools of red that surrounded them. Maybe she was trying too hard to find a motive that didn't exist. Maybe, like her, Barry was scared and sick of feeling like death could come at any time. Maybe I should stop thinking about it and do my job. Whether or not we find the others, he's right about needing to get out. We have to get back to the city, let people know what's out there. Jill straightened her shoulders and walked to the door that led to the stairwell, drawing her weapon. She'd made it this far. She could make it a little farther, try to unravel the mystery that had taken the lives of so many, or die trying, her mind whispered softly. Okay, I will pause a little bit to see what's going on in the live chat.
Oh, not
Yeah.
much is going on.
Jill's JC's excited about the Jill sandwich line too. YouTubing Jaguar, lovely mod is here. No, JC's right. Taking a break from that to read the Resident Evil novel. It's Halloween month, so I figured why not? And I've been in on a Resident Evil kick for quite a while now. I've been starting the fourth game again, and I remembered these books, and I'm like, oh man, it'd be fun to read one of these for like all month because yeah, as like a little mini stream series.
Yeah, kind of like with my weekly songs. I'm just doing all the Halloween themed songs throughout the
Yeah,
months.
yeah,
You know, with
that's
all
cool.
with all the vampires, all the zombies, with all the werewolves, all of that stuff. That so there you go.
Awesome. All right, let's get back into this.
All right.
All right. Forrest Speyer was dead. The laughing southern good old boy with his ratty clothes and easy grin was no more. That Forrest was gone, leaving behind a bloody, lifeless impostor slumped against the wall. Chris stared down at the impostor, the distant sounds of night lost to a sudden gust of wind that whipped around the eaves, moaning through the railing of the second-story patio. It was a ghostly sound, but Forrest couldn't hear it. Forrest would never hear anything again. Chris crouched down next to the still body, carefully prying Forrest's Beretta from beneath cool fingers. He told himself that he wouldn't look, but as he reached for Forrest's belt pack, he found his gaze filled on the terrible emptiness. He found his gaze fixed on the terrible emptiness where the Bravo's eyes had once been. Jesus, what happened? What happened to you, man? Forrest covered with wounds, most an inch or two across and surrounded by raw, bloody flesh. It was as if he'd been stabbed hundreds of times with a dull knife, each vicious cut ripping away chunks of skin and muscle. Part of his rib cage was cruelly exposed, slivers of white showing beneath tattered redness. His eyeless, streaming stare was the crowning horror, like the killer hadn't been content to take Forrest's life, wanting his soul instead. There were 3 clips for the Beretta in Forrest's pack. Chris shoved the magazines into a pocket and quickly stood up, tearing his gaze from the mutilated body. He looked out over the dark woods, breathing deeply. His thoughts were jumbled and grasping, trying to find an explanation, yet unable to hold on to any coherent facts. Once in the main hall, he decided to check all of the doors to see which were unlocked. And when he'd seen the bloody handprints in the tiny upstairs hall and heard the wailing cries of birds, he charged in, ready to deal out some justice. Crows. It sounded like crows, an entire flock, or a murder, actually. Pack of dogs, kindle of kittens, murder of crows. He blinked, his tired mind focusing on the seemingly random bit of trivia. Frowning, Chris crouched back down next to Forrest's ravaged body, studying the jagged wounds closely. There were dozens of tiny scratches amidst the more serious cuts, scratches set into lined patterns, claws, talons. Even as the thought occurred to him, he heard a restless flutter of wings. He turned slowly, still holding Forrest's Beretta in a hand that had suddenly gone cold. A sleek, monstrous bird was perched on the railing not 2 feet away, watching him with bright black eyes. Its smooth feathers gleamed dully against its bloated body, and a ribbon of something red and wet hung from its beak. The bird tilted its head to the side and let out a tremendous shriek, the streamer of Forrest's flesh dropping to the railing. From all around, the answering cries of its gathered siblings flooded the night air. There was a furious whisper of oversized wings as dozens of dark, fluttering shapes swooped out from beneath the eaves, screeching and clawing. Chris ran. The image of Forrest's bloody, terrible eyes burned into his pounding thoughts as he lunged for an escape. He stumbled into the tiny hall and slammed the door against the rising screams of the birds, adrenaline pumping through his system in hot, surging beats. He took a deep breath, then another, and after a moment, his heart slowed down to a more normal pace. The shrieks of the crows gradually grew distant, blown away on a softly moaning wind. Jesus, how dumb can I get? Stupid, stupid. He stormed out onto the deck, looking for a fight, looking to avenge the deaths of the other stars, and been shocked into stupidity by what he found. If he hadn't let himself get so freaked out by Forrest's death, he would have made the connection sooner between the birds and the types of wounds, and perhaps noticed the gathering flesh eaters that had watched him from the shadows, looking for their next victim. He headed for the door back to the main hall, angry with himself for going into a situation unprepared. He couldn't afford to keep making mistakes, to let his attention wander from what was in front of him. This wasn't some kind of game where he could push a reset button if he missed a trick. People were dying. His friends were dying. And if you don't pull your head out of your ass and start being more careful, you're going to join them. Another torn and lifeless body crumpled in the cold hallway somewhere, another victim to the insanity of this house. Chris silenced the nagging whisper, taking a deep breath as he stepped back into the high gallery of the lobby and closed the door behind him. Beating himself up was no more useful than charging blindly around in a strange and dangerous environment, looking for revenge. He had to concentrate on what was important, the Lost Alphas, and Rebecca. He walked toward the stairs, tucking Forrest's weapon into his waistband. At least Rebecca would be able to defend herself. Chris! Startled, he looked down to see the young STARS member at the base of the wide steps, grinning up at him. He jogged down to the stairs, glad to see her in spite of himself. What happened? Is everything all right? Rebecca held up a silver key as he reached her, still smiling widely. I found something I thought you could use. He took the key, noting that the handle was etched into a tiny shield before slipping it inside his vest. Rebecca was beaming, her eyes flashing with excitement. After you left, I played the piano and the secret door opened up in the wall. There was this gold emblem inside, like a shield, and I switched it with the one in the dining room, and the grandfather clock moved, and that key was behind it. She broke off suddenly, her smile faltering as she studied his face. I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have left, but I thought I could catch you before you got too far. It's okay, he said, forcing a smile. I'm just a little surprised to see you. Here, I found you something a little better than a can of insect repellent. He handed her the Beretta, pulling out a couple of clips to go with it. Rebecca took the gun, staring down at it thoughtfully. When she looked up at him again, her gaze was serious and intense. Who was it? Chris thought about lying, but saw that she wasn't going to buy it, and realized suddenly what it was about her that made him feel so protective, that made him want to shield her from the sad and sickening truth. Claire. That's it. Rebecca reminded him of his little sister. From her tomboy sarcasm and quick wit to the way she wore her hair. Listen, she said quietly. I know you feel responsible for me, and I admit that I'm pretty new at this, but I'm a member of this team, and sheltering me from the facts could get me killed. So, who was it? Chris stared at Rebecca for a moment, and then sighed. She was right. Forrest. I found him outside. He'd been pecked to death by the crows. Kenneth's dead, too. The sudden anguish passed across her eyes, but she nodded firmly, keeping her gaze on his. Okay, so what do we do now? Chris couldn't have the slightest of smells, trying to remember if he'd ever been so young. He motioned up the stairs, hoping that he wasn't about to make another mistake. I guess we try another. And looking at the chat. Yeah, indeed, Jaguar. It is fun for Halloween. A feast for crows. Indeed.
It's about to say about.
Yeah. Okay. This next part is in Wesker's point of view. The traitor. All right. Wesker didn't catch much of the conversation between Barry and Jill, but after a muffled good luck from Mr. Burton, he heard a door open and close somewhere nearby, and a moment later the hollow thump of bootsteps against wood, followed by another closing door. The hall outside was clear, his team off on their mission to find the rest of the Copper Crests. Looks like I picked the right room to wait in. He used the helmet key to lock himself into a small study by the back door, the perfect place from which to monitor the team's progress. Not only could he hear them coming and going, he'd be able to get a head start to the labs. He held the heavy wind crest up to the light of the desk lamp, grinning. It had been too easy, really. He'd happened across the plaster statue on his way back from talking to Barry and remembered that it had a secret compartment somewhere. Rather than waste valuable time searching, he'd simply pushed the hideous thing off the dining room balcony. It hadn't been hiding one of the crests, but the sparkle of the blue jewel amidst the rubble had been almost as good. There was a room just off the dining hall that held a statue of a tiger with one red eye and one blue, one of the few mechanisms that he'd remembered from an earlier visit. A quick visit to the statue had confirmed his eyes had been missing, and when he placed the gaudy jewel into its proper socket, the tiger had turned to one side and presented him with the crest. Just like that, he was one step closer to completing his mission. The three are in place. I'll wait until they're off looking for the final piece, then slip out the door. He considered going to check the diagram, but decided against it. The house was big, but not that big, and there was no need to expose himself to further risk of being seen. Besides, they probably hadn't managed to find any of the other crests yet. He'd already had a close call when he gone downstairs to retrieve the jewel, almost stepping directly into Chris Redfield's path. Chris had found the rookie, and the two of them were blundering around, probably looking for clues. Besides, this room is comfortable. Maybe I'll take a nap while I wait for the rest of them to catch up. He leaned back in the desk chair, pleased with himself for all he'd accomplished so far. What could have been a disaster was turning into quite nicely, thanks to some quick thinking on his part. He had already found one of the crests. He had Barry and Jill working for him, and he'd had the good fortune to run into Ellen Smith while he'd been in the library. Oops, scratch that. It's Dr. Ellen Smith. Thank you very much. After fetching the wind crest, he'd gone to the library to check the small side room that overlooks the estate's heliport, the entrance concealed behind a bookcase. A quick search had revealed nothing useful, and he'd been about to check the back room when Dr. Smith had shambled out to greet him. He had tried to get a date with her ever since he'd moved to Raccoon, drawn in by her long legs and platinum blonde hair. He'd always been partial to blondes, particularly smart ones. Not only had she repeatedly turned him down, she hadn't even tried to be nice about it. When he'd called her Ellen, she'd coolly informed him that she was his superior and a doctor, and would be addressed as such, Ice Queen, through and through. If she hadn't been so damned good-looking, he never would have bothered in the first place. But my, how your beauty has faded, Dr. Ellen. Wesker closed his eyes, smiling, reliving the experience. It had been the ratty strings of blonde hair that had given her away as she shuffled out from behind a shelf, moaning and reaching for him. Her legs were still long, but they'd lost a lot of their appeal, not to mention a fair amount of skin. What lovely perfume you're wearing, Dr. Smith, he'd said. Then 2 shots to the head, and she'd gone down in a spray of blood and bone. Wesker didn't like to think of himself as a shallow man, but pulling the trigger on that high-riding bitch had been wonderfully, no, deeply gratifying. Like icing on a cake, a little bonus perk for taking matters in hand. Maybe if I'm lucky, I'll run into that prick Sarton down in the labs. After a few moments, Wesker stood up and stretched, turning to scan some of the titles on the bookshelf behind him. He was eager to get moving, but it might take the stars a while to find the rest of the puzzle pieces, and there was really nothing he could do to hurry the process. He might as well keep busy. He frowned, struggling to make sense of the technical titles. One of the books was called Phagements, Alpha Complementation Vectors, and the next one was cDNA Libraries and Electrophoresis Conditions. Biochemistry texts and medical journals. Terrific. Maybe he'd get that nap in after all. Just reading the titles was making him sleepy. His gaze fell across a heavy-looking tome sitting by itself on one of the lower shelves, bound in a fine red leather. He picked it up, glad to see a title he could read printed across the front, even one as stupid as Eagle of East, Wolf of West. Wait, that's the same thing written on the fountain. Wesker stared at the words, feeling his good mood slipping away. It couldn't be. The researchers had gone nuts, but surely they wouldn't have locked down the labs. There was no reason for it. He opened the book almost frantically, praying that he was wrong, and let out a low moan of helpless rage that was tucked into the sham book's glued pages. A brass medallion with an eagle engraved on it lay in the cut-away apartment, part of a key to yet another of Spencer's insane locks. It was like a punchline to a cruel joke. To get out of the house, he had to find the crests. Once out in the courtyard, he'd have to make his way through a winding maze of tunnels that ended in a hidden section of the garden, where there was an old stone fountain that marked the entrance to the underground labs. The fountain was one of Spencer's fanciful creations, a marvel of engineering that could be opened and closed to hide the facility underneath, provided, of course, that you had the keys. Two medallions made out of brass, an eagle on one, a wolf on the other. Finding the eagle meant that the gate was closed, and that meant that the wolf could be anywhere, anywhere at all, and that his chances of even getting to the lab had just dropped down to somewhere near zero. Unable to control his fury, he snatched up the medal and threw the book against the desk, knocking the lamp over with a crash and plunging the room into sudden blackness. There was no longer any point in holding on to the wind crest. His perfect plan was ruined. He'd have to give up his edge and hope that one of the others would inadvertently stumble across the wolf medal for him, secreted away somewhere on the massive, sprawling estate, which means more risk, more searching, and a chance that one of them will reach the labs before I do. Seething, Wesker stood in the dark silence with his fists clenched, trying not to scream. Oh boy. J.C. Armitage. he says, he says, so that's why Jill is blonde in RE5. Possibly. But you should know that the books, like later on in the series, sort of turn alternate universe. So they don't exactly match up to the games, but close. I like that it's a little AU, so that's always interesting. I like AU and stuff. All right. Chapter 12. Jill heard something like breaking glass and held perfectly still, listening. The acoustics of the mansion were strange, the long corridors and unusual floor plan making it hard to tell where sounds were coming from, or if you even heard them at all. She sighed, taking a last look around the quiet, book-lined sitting room at the top of the stairs. She'd already checked the other 3 rooms along the gallery railing and found exactly nothing of interest. A sparse bedroom and 2 bunks, an office, and an unfinished den with a locked door and a fireplace inside. The only switches she'd found were light switches, though she had gotten excited over a rather sinister-looking black button on the wall of the office until she pushed it, and found that she'd managed to discover the drainage control for an empty fish tank in the corner. She'd found some ammo for the Remington. She supposed she should be grateful for that. A dozen shells in a metal box underneath one of the bunks in the bedroom. but if there had been any hidden crests, she'd missed them. Jill took out Trent's computer and checked the map, finding her position at the top of the stairs. Just past the sitting room's second door was a wide, U-shaped corridor that angled back around to the front hall balcony. The corridor also connected to two rooms, one a dead end and the other leading through several more. She put the computer away and drew her Beretta, taking a moment to clear her mind before stepping into the corridor. It wasn't easy. Between trying to figure out what had happened in the house to create monsters and her concerns for and about her team, her thoughts were distinctly messy. Should have looked closer at those papers. The office had been simple, a desk, a bookshelf. There was a rack of lab coats by the door, and the papers strewn across the desk had mostly been lists of numbers and letters. She knew just enough chemistry to know what she was looking at, to know that she was looking at chemistry, so she didn't bother trying to read them. But since finding the papers, she had begun to think of the zombies as the result of a research accident. The mansion was too well maintained to have come from private money, and the fact that it had been kept a secret for so long suggested a cover up. She guessed that there was a couple of months' worth of dust on almost everything, which coincided with the first attacks in Raccoon. If the people in the house had been conducting some kind of experiment and something had gone wrong, something that transformed them into flesh-eating ghouls, that's a bit far-fetched. But it made more sense than anything else she could come up with, although she kept her mind open to other possibilities. As to her concerns about the team, Barry was acting weird and Chris and Wesker were still missing. No new developments there. And there won't be any if you don't get going, right? Jill put her musings on hold and stepped out into the hall. She noticed the smell before she actually saw the zombie farther down the corridor, crumpled to the floor. The small wall scones cast an uneven glow over the body, reflecting off of dark red trim and tinting everything in the corridor smoky crimson. She trained her weapon on the still body and heard a door closing somewhere close by. Barry? He'd said he was going to be in the mansion's other wing, but maybe he'd found something and had come looking for her, or maybe she was finally going to meet up with someone else from the team. Smiling at the thought, she'd hurried down the gloomy hall, eager to see another familiar face. As she neared the corner, a fresh wave of decay washed over her, and the fallen creature at her feet grabbed at her boot, clutching her ankle with surprising strength. Startled, Jill flailed her arms to keep her balance, crying out in disgust as the slumbering zombie inched its rotting face toward her boot. Its peeling, skeletal fingers scrabbled weakly at the thick leather, seeking a firmer grip, and Jill instinctively brought down her other boot down on the back of its head, the heavy tread sliding across the skull with a sickening wet sound. A wide piece of flaking scalp tore away, revealing glistening bone. The creature kept clawing at her, oblivious to pain. The second and third kicks hit the back of its neck, and on the fourth she felt as much as she heard the dull snap of vertebrae giving out, crushed beneath her heel. The pale hands fluttered, and with a choking, liquid sigh, the zombie settled to the musty carpet. Jill stepped over the limp body and ran around the corner, swallowing back bile. She was convinced that the pitiful creatures roaming the halls were victims somehow, just as much as Becky and Pris had been, and releasing them to death was a kindness, but they were also a menace, not to mention morbidly unwholesome. She had to be more cautious. There was a door to her right, heavy wood overlaid with twining metal designs. There was a picture of armor over the key plate, but like the other doors she'd come across upstairs, it was unlocked. There was no one inside the well-lit room, but she hesitated, suddenly reluctant to continue her search for whoever else was wandering the area. Two walls of the large chamber were lined with suits of armor, each to a side, and there was a small display case at the back, not to mention a large red switch set into the middle of the gray tiled floor. Another trap or a puzzle? Intrigued, she walked into the room and headed for the glass-fronted display, the silent, lifeless guards seeming to watch her every move. There were a couple of mysterious grated holes in the floor, one on either side of the red switch, for ventilation perhaps, and she felt her heart speed up a little, suddenly sure that she had found another of the mansion's traps. A quick inspection of the dusty display case decided it for her. There wasn't any way that she could see to open it. The glass front a single thick piece, and something in one shadowy niche at the bottom of glinted like dull copper. I'm supposed to push that button, think that it will open the case, and then what? She had a vivid image of the ventilation hole sealing off and the door locking itself, a death by slow suffocation in an airless tomb. The chamber could fill with water or some kind of poisonous gas. She looked around the room, frowning, wondering if she should try to block the door open, or perhaps there was another switch hidden in one of the empty suits. Every riddle has more than one answer, Jilly. Don't forget it. Jill grinned suddenly. Why push the button at all? She crouched down next to the case and took a firm grip on the barrel of her handgun. With a single firm tap, the glass cracked, thin lines spittering away from the impact. She used the butt of the gun to knock out a thick chunk and reached carefully inside. She withdrew a hexagonal copper crest engraved with an archaic smiling sun. She smiled back at it, pleased with her solution. Apparently, some of the house's tricks could be worked around, provided she ignored a few simple rules of fair play. All the same, she found herself hurrying back to the door, not wanting to call it a win until she was clear of the solemn chamber. Stepping back into the blood-hued corridor, she stood for a moment, holding the crest as she weighed her options. She could continue to look for whoever had closed that door, or head back to the puzzle lock and place the crest. As much as she wanted to find her team, Barry had been right about needing to get out of the mansion. If any of the other stars were still alive, they'd surely also be looking for an escape. Her thoughtful gaze fell across the petite, broken creature that she killed, lingering on the slowly spreading pool of dark fluids surrounding its scabby head, and she realized suddenly that she desperately wanted to leave the house, to escape its tainted air and the pestilent creatures that stalked its cold and dusty halls. She wanted out, and as soon as was humanly possible. Her decision made, Jill hurried back the way she'd come, gripping the heavy crest tightly. She'd already uncovered two of the pieces that the stars needed to escape the mansion. She didn't know what they'd be escaping to, but anything had to be better than what they would leave behind. Richard! Rebecca immediately dropped to her knees next to the Bravo, feeling his throat for a pulse with one trembling hand. Chris stared mutely down at the torn body, already knowing that she wouldn't find a heartbeat. The gaping wound on Richard Aiken's right shoulder was drying, no fresh blood seeping through the mutilated tissue. He was dead. He watched Rebecca's slender hand slowly drop away from the Bravo's neck, and then reach up to close his glazed, unseeing eyes. Her shoulders slumped. Chris felt discovery. The communications expert had been a positive, sweet guy and only 23 years old. He looked around the silent room, searching randomly for some clue as to how Richard had died. The room they'd entered just off the second floor for a balcony was undecorated and empty, except for Richard, and there was nothing. Frowning, Chris took a few steps toward the room's second entrance and crouched down, brushing at the dark tile floor. There was a dried crust of blood in the shape of a boot heel between Richard's body and the plain wooden door 10 feet away. He stared at the door thoughtfully, tightening his hold on the Beretta. Whatever killed him is on the other side, maybe waiting for more victims. Chris, take a look at this. Rebecca was still kneeling by Richard, her gaze fixed on the bloody mass of his torn shoulder. Chris joined her, not sure what he was supposed to be looking at. The wound was ragged and messy, the flesh discolored by trauma. Strange, though, how it didn't seem very deep. See those purple lines radiating out from the cuts? And the way the muscle has been punctured here and here? She pointed out two dark holes about 6 inches apart, each surrounded by skin that had turned an infected looking red. Rebecca sat back on her heels, looking up at him. I think he was poisoned. It looks like a snake bite. Chris stared at her. What snake gets that big? She shook her head, standing. Got me. Maybe it was something else, but that wound shouldn't have killed him, or it would have taken hours for him to bleed out. I'm pretty sure that he was poisoned. Chris regarded her with new respect. She had good eye for details and was handling herself remarkably well, considering. He searched Richard's body quickly, coming up with another full clip and a shortwave radio. He handed both to Rebecca, tucking Richard's empty Beretta into his waistband. He looked at the door again, then back at Rebecca. Whatever killed him might be back there. Then we'll have to be careful, she said. Without another word, she walked to the door and stood there, waiting for him. I've got to stop thinking of her as a kid. She's outlived most of the rest of the team already. She doesn't need me to patronize her or tell her to wait behind. He stepped up to the door and nodded at her. She turned the knob and pushed it open, both of them raising their weapons as they edged into a narrow hallway. Straight ahead were a few wood steps leading to a closed door. To the left, an offshoot of the hall, another door at the end. There was blood smeared on the walls bordering the steps, and Chris was suddenly certain that it was Richards. His killer was behind that door. He motioned down the offshoot, speaking quietly. You take that room. If you run into any trouble, come back here and wait. Check back in 5 minutes either way. Rebecca nodded and moved down the narrow hall. Chris waited until she'd gone into the room before climbing the steps, his heart already thudding solidly against his ribs. The door was locked, but Chris saw that there was a tiny shield etched next to a keyhole. Rebecca was turning out to be more useful than he could have possibly imagined. He took the key she'd given him and unlocked the wide door, checking his Beretta before moving inside. It was a large attic, as plain and unassuming as the rest of the mansion was ornate. Wooden support beams extended from the floor to the sloping ceiling, and other than a few boxes and barrels against the walls, it was empty. Chris walked further in, his guard up as he scanned for movement. At the other side of the long room was a partial wall, maybe 4 feet by 9, standing several feet from the back of the attic. It reminded him of a horse stall, and it was the only area that wasn't open to view. Chris moved toward it slowly, his boots against the wood floor sending hollow echoes through the cool air. He edged to the wall, training his Beretta over the top as he peered down, heart pounding. No snake, but there was a jagged hole near the floorboards between the two walls, a foot high and a couple across, and a strange acrid odor, musky like the smell of some wild animal. Frowning at the scent, Chris started to back away and stopped, leaning in closer. There was a rounded piece of metal next to the hole, like a penny the size of a small fist. There was something engraved on it, a crescent shape. Chris walked around the side and into the stall, keeping a wary eye on the hole as he crouched down and picked up the metal piece. It was a six-sided disc of copper with a moon on it, a nice bit of craftsmanship. Inside the hole, a soft sliding sound. Chris jumped back, targeting the opening as he moved. He backed up quickly until his shoulders brushed the attic wall, then started to edge away, and a dark cylinder shot out of the opening, lightning fast. It was as big around as a dinner plate, and it hit the wall inches from his right leg, wood crunching from the impact. Oh shit, that's a snake! Chris stumbled away as the giant reptile reared back, pulling more of its long, dusky body out of the wall. Hissing, it raised up, lifting its head as high as Chris's chest and exposing dripping fangs. Chris ran halfway across the room and spun, firing at the massive diamond-shaped head. The snake let out a strange hissing cry as a shot tore through one side of its gaping mouth, punching a hole through the tightly stretched skin. It dropped back to the floor and whipped itself toward him with a single waving push of its muscular body, at least 20 feet long. Chris fired again, and a chunk of scaly flesh erupted from the snake's back, dark blood spewing from the wound. With another roaring hiss, the animal reared up in front of him, its head only inches away from Chris's gun, blood gushing from the hole in its mouth. Eyes, get the eyes! Chris pulled the trigger, and the snake fell across him, knocking him toward to the floor, its body thrashing wildly. The tail slammed into one of the thick support beams hard enough to crack it as Chris struggled to free his pinned arms, at least to hurt it worse before he died, and the cold, heavy body suddenly went limp, sagging bonelessly to the floor. Chris! Rebecca rushed into the room and stopped cold, staring at the monstrous reptile. Whoa. His boot found one of the wooden supports, and with a tremendous shove, Chris managed to wiggle out from beneath the thick body. Rebecca reached down to help him up, her eyes wide with awe. They stared down at the wound that had killed the creature, the black liquid hole where its right eye had been, obliterated by a 9mm slug. Are you okay? She asked softly. Chris nodded. A few bruised ribs, maybe, but so what? He'd literally been inches from certain death, and all because he'd stopped to. He held up the copper crest, having to pry his clenched fingers from around the thick metal. He'd held onto it throughout the attack without even realizing it, and looking at it now, he had a gut feeling that it was important somehow. Maybe because you were almost snake food for picking it up? Rebecca took it from him, tracing a finger over the engraved moon. You find anything? He asked. Rebecca shook her head. Table, couple of shelves. What's this for, anyway? Chris shrugged, looking back down at the bloody hole where the snake's shining eye had been. He shuddered involuntarily, thinking of what would have happened if he'd missed that final shot. Maybe we'll figure it out somewhere along the way, he said quietly. Come on, let's get out of here. Rebecca handed the crest back to him, and together they hurried out of the cold attic. He closed the door behind them. Chris realized suddenly that although he never cared before, he now absolutely he now absolutely hated snakes. I gotta take a drink of tea. All right.
Is that the end of the chapter?
Next, it's back. No, there's still more. A bit more of this chapter. I just had to pause to take a drink.
Okay, I might.
All right.
I might be having to go after this chapter is over. So just letting you know.
Okay. Okay.
So.
All right. I don't think it's too much longer. Let me check real quick here. Nope. Not much longer.
Okay.
All right. Barry walked up heavily up the stairs in the main hall, the knot of dread in the pit of his stomach tightening with each step. He'd been through every room he could open in the East Wing and had come up empty-handed. The same horrible images played through his mind over and over as he trudged up the steps. Kathy and Moriah and Pollyann, terrified and suffering at the hands of strangers in their own home. Kathy knew the combination to the gun safe in the basement, but the chances of her making it down the stairs before someone could get in. Barry reached the first landing and took a deep, shaky breath. Kathy wouldn't even think to run for the weapons if she heard someone breaking through one of the windows or doors. Her first priority would be to get to the girls, to make sure they were okay. If I don't turn up those crests soon, nothing will be okay. He hadn't seen a phone or radio anywhere in the house. If Wesker couldn't get to that laboratory, how would he be able to contact the people at White Umbrella and call off the killers? Barry reached the door on the upper landing that led into the West Wing. His only hope was that either Jill or Wesker had managed to find the 3 missing pieces. He didn't know where Wesker was, although he had no doubts that the rat bastard would turn up soon enough. But Jill would probably still be searching upstairs. They could split up the rooms if she hadn't checked, and at least rule out the least likely areas. If they couldn't uncover any more of the crests, he'd have to go back through the East Wing and start ripping apart furniture. He opened the door that led into the red hallway, lost in thought, and very nearly ran into Chris Redfield and Rebecca Chambers as they stepped out of the doorway on his right. Chris's face lit up with a broad, beaming grin. "Barry!" The younger man stepped forward and embraced him roughly, then backed up, still grinning. "Jesus, it's good to see you. I was starting to think that me and Rebecca were the last ones alive. Where are Jill and Wesker?" Barry pasted a smile on as he fumbled for an acceptable answer, feeling almost sick with guilt. Lying to Jill hadn't been easy, but he'd known Chris for years. Kathy and the girls dead. "Jill and I came after you, but all the doors in that hall were locked, and when we got back to the lobby, the captain was gone. Since then, we've been looking for you two and trying to find a way out." Barry smiled more naturally. "It's good to see you too, both of you. At least that much is true." "So Wesker just disappeared?" Chris asked. Barry nodded, uncomfortable. "Yeah, and we found Ken. One of those ghouls got to him." Chris sighed. "I saw Forrest and Richard are dead too." Barry felt a wave of sadness and swallowed thickly, suddenly hating Wesker even more. The people Wesker worked for had done this, and now they wanted to cover it all up, avoiding responsibility for their actions. And like it or not, I'm going to help them do it. Barry took a deep breath and fixed an image of his wife and daughters in his mind's eye. "Jill found the back door, and we think it could be a way out. Except It's got this trick lock, like a puzzle, and we have to get all the pieces together to open it. There are these four metal crests made out of copper. Jill got one already, and we think the rest are hidden throughout the mansion. He trailed off at Chris's sudden grin as Chris reached into his vest. Something like this? Barry stared at the crests that Chris had produced, feeling his heart speed up. Yeah, that's one of them. Where'd you find it? Rebecca spoke up, smiling shyly. He had to fight a big snake for it. A really big snake. I think it may have been affected by the accident, though a cross genus virus. Those are pretty rare. Barry reached for the crest as casually as he could manage, frowning. Accident? Chris nodded. We found some information that suggests there's some kind of secret research facility here on the estate, and that something they were working on got loose. A virus. One that can apparently infect mammals and reptiles, Rebecca added. Not just different species, different families. It certainly infected mine, Barry thought bleakly. He let his frown deepen, feigning thoughtfulness as he struggled to come up with an excuse to get away. The captain wouldn't approach him unless he was alone, and he was desperate to get the copper piece into place to prove that he was still on board, cooperating, and that he'd convinced the rest of the team to help him look. He could feel the seconds ticking away, the metal growing warm beneath his sweating fingers. We need to get to we need to get the feds in on this, he said finally. A full investigation, military support, quarantine the area. Chris and Rebecca were both nodding, and again Barry felt nearly overwhelmed by guilt. God, if only they weren't so trusting. But to do that, we have to find all of these crests. Jill might have turned up another one by now, maybe both of them. I can only pray. Do you know where she is? Chris asked. Barry nodded, thinking fast. I'm pretty sure, but this place is kind of a maze. Why don't you wait in the main hall while I go get her? That way we can organize our search, do a more thorough job, he smiled, hoping it looked more convincing than it felt. Though, if we don't turn up soon, keep looking for more of those pieces. The back door is at the end of the west wing corridors, first floor. Chris just stared at him for a moment, and Barry could see the questions forming in his bright gaze. Questions that Barry wouldn't be able to answer. Why split up at all? What about finding the missing captain? How could he be certain that the back door was an escape? Please, please just do as I say. Okay, Chris said reluctantly. We'll wait, but if she's not where you think she is, come back and get us. We stand a better chance making it through this place if we stick together. Barry nodded, and before Chris could say anything more, he turned and jogged away down the dim hall. He'd seen the hesitation in Chris's eyes, heard the uncertainty in his voice, and then with his final words, Barry had felt himself wanting desperately to warn his friend of Wesker's betrayal. Leaving was the only way to keep himself from saying something he might regret, something that might get his family killed. As soon as he heard the door back to the balcony close, he picked up speed, taking the corners at full run. There was a dead zombie near the door that led to the stairs, and Barry leaped over it, the stench falling away as he ducked through the connecting passage. He took the back stairs at a time, as his conscience yammered mercilessly away at him, reminding him of his treachery. You're a liar, Barry, using your friends the way Wesker's using you, playing on their trust. You could have told them what was really going on, let them help you put a stop to it. Barry shook the thoughts away as he reached the door to the covered walk, slamming the heavy metal aside. He couldn't risk it. Wouldn't. What if Wesker had been nearby and had overheard? The captain had Barry's family to blackmail him with, and once Chris and the others knew the truth, what was to stop Wesker from just killing them? If he helped Wesker destroy the evidence, The stars wouldn't be able to prove anything. The captain could just let them all walk away. Barry reached the diagram next to the back door and stopped, staring. Relief flooded through him, cool and sweet. 3 of the 4 openings were filled. The sun, wind, and star crests in place. It was over. He can get to the lab now. Call off his people. He doesn't need us anymore. I can go back in and keep the team busy while he does whatever he has to do. The RPD will show up eventually and we can forget this ever happened. He was so elated that he didn't register the muted footsteps on the stone path behind him. Didn't realize that he wasn't alone anymore until Wesker's smooth voice spoke up beside him. Why don't you finish the puzzle, Mr. Burton? Barry jumped, startled. He glared at Wesker, loathing the smug, bland face behind the sunglasses. Wesker smiled, nodding his head at the copper crest in Barry's hand. Yeah, right, Barry muttered darkly, and slipped the final piece into place. There was a thick metallic sound from inside the door. Ka-chink! And Wesker walked past him, pushing the door open to reveal a small, well-used tool shed. Barry peered inside, saw the exit at the opposite wall. There was no diagram set next to it, no more crazy puzzles to figure out. Kathy and the girls were safe. With a low bow, Wesker motioned for Barry to step inside the shed, still smiling. Time's short, Barry, and there's still a lot for us to do. Barry stared at him, confused. What do you mean? We can get to the lab now. Well, there's been a slight change of plans. See, it turns out that I need to find something else, and I have an idea of where it might be, but there are some dangers involved. You've done such a good job so far, I want you to come along. Wesker's smile transformed into a shark-like grin, a cold, pitiless reminder of what was at stake. In fact, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to insist on it. After a long, terrible moment, Barry nodded helplessly. That's the end of that chapter.
All right.
So, what'd you think of the book?
I like it. I like it. Love the sound of it too.
Yeah, you're gonna have to catch up on the other 2 parts sometime.
Yeah. Well, anyways, this has been great. So I'm going to go ahead and get going and see you all tomorrow morning with my special guest.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
It's going to be. So I got another epic show on my hands, hopefully.
Yeah, so. I'm looking forward to it. I'll be there.
All right. Y'all have a good night.
Yep. Good night, Nate. Thanks for coming by. All right. Chris killed the giant snick with just the handgun. That's impressive. Head thing without the shotgun. Yep. Chris, he's a tough old guy. Well, he punches a boulder in RE5 eventually. You know, I saw this parody of that was like a Resident Evil abridged. And there was mentioning of Chris running away from a boulder, and then Chris saying, "Next time I'll punch the boulder." Yeah, that's too bad. I guess you're gonna have to catch up. Okay, 13. My dearest Alma, I sit here trying to think of where to begin, of how to explain in a few simple words all that's happened in my life since we last spoke, and already I fail. I hope this letter finds you well and whole, and that you will forgive the tangents of my pen. This isn't easy for me. Even as I write, I can feel the simplest of concepts slipping away, lost to feelings of despair and confusion. But I have to tell you what's in my heart before I can rest. Be patient and accept that what I tell you is the truth. The entire story would take hours for me to tell you, and time is short, so accept these things as fact. Last month, there was an accident in the lab, and the virus we were studying escaped. All my colleagues who were infected are dead or dying, and the nature of the disease is such that those still living have lost their senses. This virus robs its victims of their humanity, forcing them into their sickness to seek out and destroy life. Even as I write these words, I can hear them pressing against my locked door like mindless, hungry animals, crying out like lost souls. There aren't words true enough, deep enough to describe the sorrow and shame that I feel knowing I had a hand in their creation. I believe that they feel nothing now, no fear or pain, but that they can't experience the horror of what they've become doesn't free me of my terrible burden. I am, in part, responsible for this nightmare that surrounds me. In spite of the guilt that is burned into my very being, that will haunt my every breath, I might have tried to survive if only to see you again, but my best efforts only delayed the inevitable. I am infected, and there is no cure for what will follow except to end my life before I lose the only thing that separates me from them, my love for you. Please understand. Please know that I'm sorry. Martin Crackhorn. Yeah, the boulder punching scene. I've seen YouTube footage of it. Okay. Jill sighed, laying the crumpled paper gently on the desk. The creatures were victims of their own research. It seemed she'd had the right idea about what had happened in the mansion, though reading the heartfelt letter put a serious damper on any pride she might have taken from her deduction skills. After placing the suncrest, she decided that the upstairs office merited a closer look, and with a little digging, she found the final scrawled testament of Crackhorn tucked in a drawer. Crackhorn, Martin Crackhorn. That was one of the names on Trent's list. Jill frowned, walking slowly back to the office door. For some reason, Trent wanted the stars to figure out what had happened at the mansion before anyone else did. But what's as much as he obviously knew about it, why not just tell them outright? And what did he stand to gain by telling them anything at all? She stepped through the office's small foyer and back out into the hall, still frowning. Barry had been acting strange before, and she needed to find out why. Maybe she could get a straight answer if she just asked him outright, or maybe not. Either way, it'll tell me something. Jill stopped by the back stairs, taking a deep breath, and realized that something was different. She looked around uncertainly, trying to figure out what it was her senses were telling her. It's warmer, just a little, but it's definitely warmer, and the air isn't quite as stale, like someone had opened a window or maybe a door. Jill turned and jogged down the stairs, suddenly anxious to check the puzzle lock. Reaching the bottom of the steps, she saw that the door connecting one hall to the next was standing open. She could hear crickets singing faintly, feel the fresh night air wafting toward her through the frigid mustiness of the house. She hurried to the darker corridor and hooked a right, trying not to get her hopes up. Another sharp right, and she could see the door that led to the covered walkway standing open. Maybe that's all it is. It doesn't mean the puzzle's solved. Jill broke into a run, feeling the clean warmth of summer air against her skin as she rounded the corner in the stone path and let out a short, triumphant laugh as she saw the four placed crests next to the open door. A warm breeze was flowing through the room that the puzzle had unlocked, and a small storage shed for gardening tools. The metal door on the wall opposite was standing open, and Jill could see moonlight playing across a brick wall just past the rusted hinges. Barry had been right. The door led outside. They'd be able to get help now, find a safe route through the woods, or at least a signal. But if Barry found the missing pieces, why didn't he come looking for me? Jill's grin faded as she stepped into the shed, absently taking in the dusty boxes and barrels that lined the gray stone walls. Barry had known where she was and suggested himself that she take the second floor of the west wing, so maybe it wasn't Barry who opened the door. True, it could have been Chris or Wesker or one of the Bravos. If that was the case, she should probably go back in and look for Barry, or investigate a little first, make sure it's worth the effort. It was a bit of a rationalization, but she had to admit to herself that the thought of returning to the mansion with a possible escape in front of her wasn't all that enticing. She unholstered her Beretta and walked toward the outer door, her decision made. The first thing she noticed was the sound of rushing water over the soft forest noises that filled the cooling air like a waterfall. The second and third were the bodies of two dogs that lay across the irregular stone path, shot to death. Pretty safe bet that one of the stars came through this way. Jill edged out into a high-walled courtyard. Low hedges set into brick planters on either side. Dark clouds hung oppressively low overhead. Across the open space was a barred iron gate, just past an island of shrubs. To her left, a straight path overshadowed by the 10-foot-high brick walls that bordered it. The gentle waterfall sound seemed to come from that direction, though the path ended abruptly into a metal gate a few feet high. Stairs going down, maybe? Jill hesitated, looked back at the arched rusty gate in front of her, and then at the curled bodies of the mutant dogs. They were both closer to the gate than the walkway, and assuming they'd been killed while attacking, the shooter would have been headed in that direction. There was a sudden sound of water splashing wildly, making the decision for her. Jill turned and ran down the moonlit walk, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. She reached the end of the stone path and leaned over the gate, then drew back a little, surprised by the sudden drop-off. There were no stairs. The gate opened to a tiny platform elevator and a huge, open courtyard 20 feet below. The splashing was off to the right, and Jill looked down and across the wide yard just in time to see a shadowy figure walk through the waterfall she'd heard, disappearing behind the curtain of water that cascaded down the west wall. What the hell? She stared at the small waterfall, blinking, not sure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. The splashing had stopped as soon as the person disappeared, and she was fairly certain that she wasn't hearing things, which meant the rushing water concealed a secret passage. Great. It's just what this place needs. Lord knows I didn't get enough of that inside. The controls for the one-man lift were on a metal bar next to the rusting gate, the platform itself down in the courtyard. Jill toggled the power switch, but nothing happened. She'd have to get down another way, wasting time while the mysterious splasher got farther away, unless... Jill looked down the narrow elevator shaft, an inset square of only 3 feet across, and open on the side facing the yard. Coming up would be a bitch, but descending, cake. She could crouch her way down in a minute or less, using her back legs to support her weight. As she unstrapped the shotgun from her back in preparation for the climb, a disturbing thought occurred to her. If the person who'd gone through the waterfall was one of the stars, how had they known that the passage was even there? Good question, and not one she wanted to linger over. Holding the shotgun tightly, Jill pushed the gate open and carefully started down the shaft. Okay, now it's back to Chris and Rebecca. They'd given Barry a full 15 minutes before heading through the winding halls of the West Wing and finding the open back door. They stood there now, looking at the slab of copper and its 4 engraved crests. Chris stared at the crescent moon that Barry had taken, feeling confused and more than a little worried. Barry was one of the most honest, straightforward guys that he had ever known. If he said that he was going to look for Jill and then come back for them, then that's what he meant to do. But he didn't come back. And if he ran into trouble, how did the piece I gave him end up here? He didn't like any of the explanations his mind was giving him to work with. Someone could have taken it from him. He could have placed it himself and been injured somehow. The possibilities seemed endless, and none of them good. Sighing, he turned away from the diagram and looked at Rebecca. Whatever happened to Barry, we should go ahead. This may be the only way off the estate. Rebecca smiled a little. Fine by me. It just feels good to get out of here, you know? Yeah, no kidding, he said, with feeling. He hadn't even realized how accustomed he'd grown to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the house until they'd left it. The difference was truly amazing. They walked through the tidy storage room and stopped at the back door, both of them breathing deeply. Rebecca checked her Beretta for about the 100th time since they'd left the main hall, chewing at her lower lip nervously. Chris could see how tightly wound she was and tried to think if there was anything she needed to know, anything that would help her if they were forced into a combat situation. Star's training covered all the basics, but shooting at a video screen with a toy gun was a far cry from the real thing. He grinned suddenly, remembering the words of wisdom he'd gotten on his first operation, a standoff with a small group of whacked out survivalists in upstate New York. He'd been terrified and trying desperately not to show it. A captain for the mission had been a tough as nails explosive expert, an extremely short woman named Kaler. She'd pulled him aside just before they went in, looked him up and down, and given him the single best piece of advice he'd ever received. Son, she said, no matter what happens, when the shooting starts, try not to wet your pants. It had surprised him out of his nervousness, but the statement's so totally weird. The statement's so totally weird that he'd literally been forced to let go of the worst of his fear to make room for it. What are you grinning about? Chris shook his head, faced the smile fading. Somehow, he didn't think it would work on Rebecca, and the dangers they faced didn't shoot back. Long story. Come on, let's go. They moved out into the calm night air, crickets and cicadas buzzing sleepily in the surrounding woods. They were in the kind of courtyard, high brick walls on either side, an offshoot walkway to their left. Chris could hear rushing water nearby and the mournful cry of a dog or coyote in the distance. A lonely, faraway sound. Speaking of dogs, there were a couple of them sprawled out across the stones, soft moonlight glistening against their wet, sinewy bodies. Chris edged up to one of them and crouched down, touching its flank. He quickly pulled his hand back, scowling. The mutant dog was sticky and warm, like it had been sheathed in a thick layer of mucus. He stood up, wiping his hand on his pants. Hasn't been dead long, he said quietly. Less than an hour, anyway. There was a rusted iron gate just past some hedges in front of them. Chris nodded at Rebecca as they walked toward it. The sound of rushing water increased to a dull roar. Chris pushed at the gate, and it swung open on violently squealing hinges, revealing a huge cut stone reservoir, easily the size of a couple of swimming pools put together. Deep shadows draped and hung at every side, caused by the seemingly solid walls of murky green trees and lush vegetation that threatened to break through the bordering rails. They moved forward, stopping at the edge of the massive pool. It was apparently in the slow process of being drained. The turbulent noise caused by the narrow flow of water through a raised gate on the east side. There wasn't a complete path around the reservoir, but Chris saw that there was a walkway bisecting the pool itself, about 5 feet below water level. There were bolted ladders at both sides, and the path had obviously been submerged until quite recently. The stones dark with dripping algae. Chris studied the unusual setup for a moment, wondering how anyone got across when it wasn't being drained. Another mystery to add to the growing list. Without speaking, they climbed down and hurried across, boots squelching against the slimy stones, a clammy humidity enveloping them. Chris quickly scaled the second ladder, reaching down to help Rebecca up. The heavily shaded path was littered with branches and pine needles, and appeared to border the east end of the reservoir. Passing over the open floodgate, they started toward the forest waterfall and had only gotten a few feet when it started to rain. Plop, plop, plop. Chris frowned, an inner voice informing him coolly that he shouldn't be able to hear raindrops over the roar of the draining water. He looked up and saw a twisted branch fall from the stretching foliage hanging over the rail, a branch that hit the stones and slid smoothly away. It's not a branch. And there were dozens of them already on the ground, twisting across the dark stones, hissing and writhing as they fell from the trees overhead. He and Rebecca were surrounded by snakes. Oh, shit! Startled, Rebecca turned to look at Chris and felt a cold terror shoot through her. Her heart squeezed in its icy grip as she took in the path behind him. The ground had come to life, black shapes coiling around their feet and dropping from above like living rain. Rebecca started to raise her gun, realizing numbly that there were too many even as Chris roughly grabbed her arm. Run! They stumbled forward, Rebecca crying out involuntarily as a thick, writhing body fell across her shoulder, a touch of cruel scales against her arm as it slid heavily off and hit the stones. The path zigzagged, and they ran through the shifting shadows, heels crunching down on rubbery, moving flesh, throwing them off balance. Snakes darted forward to strike at their passing boots as they ran over a steel grate, black, foaming water thundering below. The sound of their boots hitting metal lost to the liquid roar. Ahead of them, the stones were clearer, but the path also dropped off sharply, a small elevator platform marking its end. There was no place left to go. They crowded onto the tiny platform, and Rebecca snatched at the controls, her breath coming up in panicked gasps. Chris turned and fired repeatedly, the shots blasting over the crash of water as Rebecca found the operating button and slammed it down. The platform shuddered and started to descend, slipping down past rock walls toward a massive, empty courtyard below. Rebecca turned, raising the bread to help Chris. and felt her jaw drop, her throat locking at the gruesome scene. There had to be hundreds of them, the path almost completely hidden by slithering creatures, hissing and squirming in an alien frenzy as they struck wildly at each other. By the time she managed to unfreeze, the loathsome sight had risen past eye level and was gone. The ride seemed to last forever, both of them staring up at the edge of the path they'd left behind, tensely, breathlessly waiting for the bodies to start falling. When the lift was within few feet of the bottom, they both jumped off, stumbling quickly away from the wall. They both leaned against the cool rock, gasping. Rebecca took in the courtyard they'd escaped to, and between shuddering breaths, letting the sound of the splashing waterfall soothe her nerves. It was huge. It was a huge open space made out of brick and stone, the colors washed out and hazy in the frail light. The water from the reservoir above tumbled down into two stone pools nearby, and there was a single gate across from them, and no snakes. She took a final deep breath and blew it out, then turned to Chris. Were you bit? He shook his head. You? No, she said. Though if it's all the same to you, I'd rather not go back that way. I'm more of a cat person, really. Chris stared at her for a moment and then grinned, pushing away from the fall. Funny, I would have figured you for lab rats. Beep beep! The radio. Rebecca grabbed at the unit hooked to her belt, the snakes suddenly forgotten. It was the sound she'd been hoping to hear ever since they'd found Richard. They were being hailed, maybe by searchers. She thumbed the receiver and held the radio up so they could both hear. Static crackled through the tinny speaker, along with the soft whine of a wavering signal. This is Brad, Alpha Team. Read, if can't hear this. His voice disappeared in a burst of static. Rebecca hit the transmit button and spoke quickly. Brad? Brad, come in. The signal was gone. They both listened for a moment longer. No, but nothing else came through. He must have gotten out of range, Chris said. He sighed, walking further out into the open yard and gazing up at the dark, overcast sky. Rebecca clipped the silent radio back to her belt, still feeling more hopeful than she had all night. The pilot was out there somewhere, circling around and looking for them. Now that they were clear of the mansion, they'd be able to hear him signal, assuming he comes back. Rebecca ignored the thought and walked over to join Chris, who had found another tiny elevator platform tucked in the corner across from the waterfall. Quick check showed it to be without power. Chris turned toward the gate, slapping a fresh clip into his Beretta. Shall we see what's behind door number 1? It was a rhetorical question. Unless they wanted to go back through the snakes, it was their only option. Just the same, Rebecca smiled and nodded, wanting to make sure he knew she was ready, and hoping desperately if anything else happened, she would be. Oh, well, let's see here. I don't know. I think it's a good place to stop for tonight. It's starting to get late, and yeah, and I started late because of stuff that had to be done that my family and I had to do after I got off work. Uh, yep, so we covered 3 long chapters. Let's see. Yeah, Yep. 11, 12, and 13. Okay. Well, thanks to Nate for showing up in the call for a while. Thanks to YouTubing Jaguar and JC Armitage for showing up to listen in to the next part. See ya again on Wednesday night to continue with the next one, starting at chapter 14 onward. And shouldn't be starting late next time. So, good night, all. It's been fun. Take care now. See you on Wednesday night.